The conference room went silent when the man in the paint-stained jacket set a single photograph on the table. A photograph of himself standing in front of the building where they'd just told him he didn't belong. The executives had been laughing 30 seconds earlier. The security guard still had his hand on the man's arm. The new CEO had personally ordered him removed for causing a disturbance in the lobby. Nobody noticed the calluses on his hands. Nobody looked past the mud on his boots. They didn't know they'd just humiliated the man who had built every wall of this hospital with his own money, his own grief, and 15 years of keeping a promise to a woman who never got to see it finished. If you want to know how a janitor brought a room full of suits to their knees, stay until the end. Claire Ashworth had been CEO of Harlan Memorial Medical Center for 11 months, and she had not once been late to a meeting. She was not going to start today. She noticed the man the way she noticed most things in the lobby, briefly, clinically, while moving towards something else. He was standing near the information desk with a boy of maybe 7 or 8 who had a dinosaur backpack and the particular stillness of a child who had learned not to ask questions in adult places. The man wore a canvas work jacket with a tear near the left pocket. His boots were the kind that came from actual work, not a catalog. He was speaking quietly to the woman at the desk, Dorothy, who had worked the front desk for longer than Claire had been alive, and who was currently shaking her head with an expression that said she wished she could do otherwise. Claire kept walking. She had a budget presentation in 9 minutes, and a board member who was flying in from Phoenix specifically to push through a proposal she didn't trust. She didn't have time for whatever this was. Her assistant, Kevin, appeared at her elbow. The gentleman at the desk has been here since 7:30. He's asking to speak with hospital leadership. He doesn't have an appointment, then tell him to make one. He says it's urgent. He mentioned the Whitfield Wing. Claire stopped. The Whitfield Wing was the pediatric oncology unit that had been under construction for 8 months and was currently 6 weeks behind schedule and $4 million over the projected budget. It was the single largest capital project in Harlan Memorial's history, and it was the thing that kept her awake at night more than anything else. Did he say why? No, he just keeps asking to speak with whoever's in charge now. Whoever's in charge now, an odd way to put it. Have security ask him to wait, Claire said. If he's still there after the meeting, I'll see him. She didn't look back as she took the elevator to the 4th floor. She didn't hear the little boy ask his grandfather, "Pop, why won't they talk to us?" The boardroom had the particular temperature of a room where important people had been waiting for someone important to arrive. Gerald Marsh sat at the head of the table with the posture of a man who had not waited for anyone in many years. He was 71, recently appointed to the board of directors by a group of institutional investors who had quietly accumulated enough shares to install someone they could count on. He had silver hair and the kind of tan that came from places with golf courses. Claire. He said her first name with the patience of a man who had decided some time ago to be patient with her. We're ready to move. Sandra Okafor, the chief of pediatrics, looked up from the end of the table with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. Sandra had been at Harlan for 18 years. She rarely came to budget meetings. The fact that she was here today told Claire something. Before we move, Claire said, setting down her folder, I want to go through the occupancy projections for the Whitfield Wing one more time. Gerald smiled. We've been through them twice. I'd like to go through them again. The contractors are ready to finalize. Every week we delay costs the hospital $40,000 in carrying fees. Every week we rush costs us more than that if we get it wrong. Claire opened her folder. The current proposal reduces the number of patient rooms from 24 to 18. I want to understand why, efficiency. Gerald's voice had the tone of a man explaining something to someone who was new to explaining things. 18 rooms at full occupancy generates more reliable revenue than 24 rooms at 60%. Pediatric oncology doesn't run at 60%, Gerald. We have children on waiting lists right now. We have families driving 4 hours from. The investors have reviewed the projections. The numbers support the reduced model. Sandra spoke quietly. 12 of those 18 rooms are already pre-committed to families who have been waiting 8 months. Then they'll be grateful for 18 rooms. Gerald folded his hands. Claire, I understand you want to be thorough, but Harlan Memorial is running a structural deficit. We cannot afford sentiment. I'm not talking about sentiment. I'm talking about the reason this wing exists. The reason it exists is to serve the hospital's mission, and the hospital's mission requires the hospital to remain solvent. Claire looked at him. Who are the current investors, Gerald? The ones who reviewed these projections? Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite discomfort, something more practice than that. A consortium, institutional partners. You'll receive the full disclosure in the board packet. I'd like the names now. That's not standard procedure. It is when I'm being asked to approve a construction change order that permanently reduces our capacity. Claire kept her voice even. I'll have the names before I sign anything. Gerald's smile didn't change, but something in the room did. Kevin knocked and opened the boardroom door. His face was apologetic, but also something else. Urgent in a way that didn't look routine. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation in the lobby. Security's involved. It's escalating. Gerald waved his hand. We're in the middle of, I'll handle it, Claire said. She took the stairs down. What she found in the lobby was not a situation in the administrative sense. It was a man standing very still while two security officers tried to move him toward the exit, and a small boy pressed against the man's side, with his face turned in and his shoulders up around his ears. And Dorothy at the front desk with her hands flat on the counter, looking like she was about to say something she'd been waiting to say for a long time. A small cluster of nurses and orderlies had stopped what they were doing. One of them had her phone out. Sir, the taller security officer was saying, "You've been asked to leave 3 times. I'm not causing any trouble." The man's voice was quiet, controlled in the way of someone who had learned to stay calm inside situations that should not require calmness. "I just need 5 minutes. You don't have authorization to be here without an appointment. Pop." The boy's voice was very small. "Can we go?" The man put his hand on the back of the boy's head, a single, steadying gesture. Claire came down the last 3 steps, and the cluster of onlookers parted slightly. She looked at the man properly for the first time. He was somewhere in his late 50s, maybe 60. The work jacket up close had the specific fading of something worn through use rather than neglect. His face was weathered in the way of someone who had spent real time outside, but his eyes were clear and steady, and looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not the aggressive pleading of someone who had nothing to lose. Something older than both of those. "I'm Claire Ashworth," she said, CEO. "You wanted to speak to someone in charge?" "Yes." He shifted slightly, keeping himself between her and the boy, a small instinctive movement. "My name is Thomas Hale. I have information about the Whitfield Wing that your board needs to hear before they vote today." Behind her, Claire heard the elevator open. She didn't turn around. "What kind of information?" "Financial. The construction contract your hospital signed 6 weeks ago has a substitution clause in Section 9 that allows the primary contractor to swap specified materials for alternatives within the same cost tier. Those alternatives," he paused, "they don't meet pediatric safety codes." The elevator had definitely opened. Claire could feel Gerald Marsh approaching without turning to look. "Who told you that?" "I was the site supervisor on this building for 3 years. I know what was spec'd for that wing, and I know what's being ordered." Thomas Hale looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I came because I thought somebody here should know before those walls go up." A voice behind her. Interesting timing. Gerald came to stand beside Claire. He looked at Thomas Hale the way he looked at most things, through the clean glass of his own certainty. "You said your name is Hale." Gerald's tone was pleasant, dangerous but pleasant. "Thomas Hale, and you're a site supervisor." "I was. So currently, you're a man who walked into a hospital without an appointment to make accusations about a construction contract you no longer have any professional connection to." Gerald looked at the security officers. "I think that's been enough of everyone's time." "He has information," Claire started. "He has a story." Gerald's voice didn't change. "Claire, this is exactly the kind of distraction that costs hospitals like ours credibility. A former employee with a grudge, probably terminated for cause, coming in off the street. I wasn't terminated." Thomas Hale's voice remained quiet. "I resigned." "Of course you did, Gerald." Claire's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm just being realistic." Gerald looked at the boy, then back at Thomas, and something passed across his face that was not quite disdain but was near enough to it. "Look, I understand it's difficult. Job losses are hard. But whatever this gentleman thinks he witnessed on a job site is not hospital business, and it is certainly not board business. The contractors are vetted. The contract is clean. And we have a meeting to finish." Thomas Hale didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at Gerald with an expression Claire would think about for a long time afterward. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope and set it on the counter in front of Dorothy. "Those are the specification sheets," he said. "The ones that were filed with the permit office and the ones that are actually being used. They're different documents." He looked at Claire. "I made copies before I resigned." Dorothy reached for the envelope before anyone could say otherwise. Gerald put his hand over it. "This is private property," he said to Thomas Hale, "and you're trespassing." "Gerald." Sandra Okafor had followed them down quietly and was now standing at the edge of the lobby with her arms folded and her chin up. Let him finish, Gerald turned to Sandra. He built this hospital. Sandra's voice was very calm. The least we can do is listen. The lobby went still. Claire looked at Sandra. Then she looked at Thomas Hale. Then she looked at the boy, who had come out slightly from behind his grandfather and was watching everything with the focused attention of a child who understood more than adults assumed. She picked up the envelope from under Gerald's hand. Conference room, she said to Thomas Hale. 5 minutes. Gerald started to speak. Claire looked at him and he stopped. The small conference room off the main corridor was used for insurance adjusters and difficult family conversations. Claire gestured to the chairs. Thomas helped the boy into one, unzipped the dinosaur backpack, and produced a worn paperback book that the boy accepted without comment and immediately opened. Claire sat across from them. She set the envelope on the table between them. Talk, she said. Thomas Hale talked. The substitution clause was real. He'd found it because he'd been reviewing the materials orders. Habit, he said. The kind of habit you built after 30 years in construction, and noticed the discrepancy between the fire suppression specifications filed with the city permit office and the equipment listed on the actual purchase orders. The spec'd system was rated for pediatric facilities. The ordered system was not. The difference in cost was about $200,000. The difference in risk was significantly harder to put a number on. There was more. The load-bearing specifications for the third-floor corridor had been quietly revised after the original engineer signed off. The revision had not been re-signed. The electrical conduit specs had been substituted with a lower grade. All of it documented in the papers now spread across the table between them. This would have been caught in the final inspection, Claire said. Maybe. Final inspectors look at what's in front of them. If the documentation says one thing and the installation matches that documentation, they pass it. The discrepancy is in the pre-installation paperwork. Where did you get all of this? I kept copies of everything I signed. When the substitutions started, I flagged them to the site manager. He told me the board had approved updated specs. I asked to see the board approval. He said it was in process. Thomas Hale looked at his hands. It was never going to be in process. Why bring this to me? Why not go to the city, the building department? I tried. The permit office said they'd look into it. That was 3 weeks ago. His voice didn't change. But something behind it did. There are children going to be in that wing. My daughter's little girl spent 14 months in a room just like the ones they're building, in a hospital that did things right. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't going to walk away from this. The boy looked up from his book. Pop, is this the place where you built the fish wall? Thomas's face changed entirely. Yeah, buddy. The fish wall. Can we see it? Maybe in a minute. Claire looked at the boy. What's the fish wall? In the children's waiting area, Thomas said. 3rd floor. There's a mosaic, fish, sea turtles, some kind of whale that my grandson drew and I promised we'd include. The tile guy thought I was crazy. For the first time, something like a smile crossed his face. We included it. Claire folded her hands on top of the documents. Mr. Hale, why does Gerald Marsh know your name? Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Because I used to be on the board, he said. Claire went very still. Not this board, the original founding board. When Harlan Memorial was established in 2003, there were 4 of us. I was the one who donated the land, the building. He said this without performance, the way someone states a fact that has long since stopped feeling significant to them. I stepped back 9 years ago when my wife got sick. I didn't want the seat anymore. I just wanted to take care of Margaret, your wife. She died 6 years ago. Pancreatic. He looked at the table. It was fast. I'm sorry. The hospital took care of her. Better than I could have alone. He looked up. That's why I'm here, because when it mattered to me personally, this place did things right. And I'm not going to let someone gut it from the inside because it's convenient for a consortium of investors I've never heard of. The door opened without a knock. Gerald Marsh filled the frame. Claire, the board is waiting. They can keep waiting. Gerald's eyes moved to Thomas Hale. Something flickered there, recognition, calculation, and something else. Thomas, it's been a long time. Gerald, you should have called me directly. I would have been happy to talk through your concerns privately. I tried to call you privately 3 weeks ago. A pause. Small, but real. I didn't receive any message. I know. The room was quiet. Gerald looked at the documents on the table, not in the way of someone seeing them for the first time. Those documents are going to look very alarming out of context, he said. There are explanations for the spec changes. Cost efficiencies that were reviewed by the engineering team. Which engineering team? Thomas asked. Because I spoke to the original engineer of record last week, and she said nobody contacted her about the revisions. Gerald's jaw moved. Just slightly. Claire, he said, I strongly recommend we take this conversation upstairs. Sit down, Gerald. He looked at her. Sit down, she said again, or leave. But the conversation is happening here. Gerald did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and Claire watched the calculation happen behind his face. How much he could afford to push, how much she was willing to push back, how many people were in the building who might walk past this conference room in the next 5 minutes. He left without another word. Claire turned back to Thomas Hale. Tell me everything, she said. Don't skip anything. She listened for 2 hours. Sandra joined them halfway through, bringing coffee for the adults and a cup of apple juice and a granola bar for the boy, who had moved from his book to a small drawing he was doing on a piece of the back of an envelope, very focused. Apparently unbothered by the adults around him, discussing engineering fraud with increasing seriousness. By the time Thomas had finished, the coffee was cold, and Sandra had filled a legal pad with notes, and Claire had a headache that had started somewhere behind her left eye, and was slowly becoming a headache that existed behind both eyes simultaneously. If this is accurate, Sandra said carefully, we are talking about a children's oncology wing that would have passed inspection and been occupied and potentially, yes, Thomas said. For how long has Gerald Marsh been on the board? He was appointed 14 months ago, Claire said. Right before I was hired. A silence. Who appointed him? Thomas asked. The Institutional Investor Group. Claire stared at the documents, the one whose names I apparently need to request through official channels. She picked up her phone and called legal. Then she called the city building department directly. Not the permit office Thomas had already tried, but the director, a woman named Patricia Vance, who owed Claire a returned call from 2 weeks ago and was going to receive it now whether she liked it or not. Then she called the original engineer of record, whose name was in the permit files, a woman named Renata Sobczak, who answered on the second ring, and when Claire explained who she was and what she was looking at, said, "Oh, thank God," with such relief that Claire understood she had been waiting for this call. Renata had been waiting for 6 weeks. She'd flagged the unsigned revision to the site manager. She'd been told it was an administrative oversight that would be corrected. She'd asked twice more. Then she'd stopped being able to reach the site manager at all. Claire put her phone down, looked at Thomas. I need to ask you something. Okay, you've been gone from this board for 9 years. You built this hospital. You put your name on it. You could have sued, gone to the press, called the AG's office. I could have. Why come here? Why come to me? Thomas Hale looked at his grandson, who was still drawing, the tip of his tongue visible at the corner of his mouth in the way of children concentrating hard on something that matters. Because I wanted to see what kind of person was running this place before I decided who to trust, he said. I've been watching for 3 months. I watched you push back on the bed reduction proposal in February. I watched you reinstate the interpreter services that the CFO tried to cut in March. I watched you sit in the waiting room on a Tuesday night, talking to a family who didn't speak much English and whose kid was admitted without anyone explaining what was happening. He paused. That family was my neighbor's daughter. She told me about it afterward. Claire was quiet for a moment. I know it's not in the job description. He looked at her directly. That's why I'm here. Gerald Marsh, as it turned out, did not take kindly to having a full board meeting convened with 48 hours' notice. He took even less kindly to the presence of Renata Sobczak, who arrived with a portable hard drive containing every original and revised specification file for the Whitfield Wing project going back 14 months, organized with the meticulousness of someone who had understood, for some time, that she might one day need to account for every keystroke. He took least kindly of all to the presence of Thomas Hale, who sat at the far end of the boardroom table in the same canvas jacket, and did not say a great deal but answered every question put to him with a specificity that left very little room for alternative interpretation. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Gerald spent the first hour doing what Gerald was evidently very good at, reframing, contextualizing, suggesting that the documents were being misread by people who lacked the full picture. He had a way of making reasonable people feel that their concerns were the result of a gap in their understanding rather than a gap in his integrity. Claire had watched him do it for 11 months. She realized, let him do it to her on more than one occasion. She did not let him do it now. The second hour involved the board's legal counsel reviewing the documents, during which Gerald was quiet in the particular way of a man recalculating. The third hour was the board asking questions. The fourth hour was Gerald's attorney joining by phone. By the time the meeting ended, the construction contract had been frozen pending independent engineering review. The investor consortium, which turned out, under the legal counsel's digging, to include a shell company with connections to the primary contractor, a conflict of interest that Gerald had not disclosed at the time of his appointment, had been reported to the state attorney general's office. Gerald had been asked to step down from the board pending investigation. He had not gone quietly. He had accused Thomas of fabricating documents out of personal grievance. He had questioned Claire's judgment and her fitness for the role. He had made, in the final 20 minutes of the meeting, a speech about fiscal responsibility and the naivety of idealistic leadership that was, Claire thought, genuinely believed by the man delivering it. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. Gerald Marsh did not think he had done anything wrong. He thought he had made rational decisions that sentimental people were choosing to mischaracterize. When security escorted him from the building, he was already on the phone with his attorney. Claire sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes after everyone else had left. The late afternoon light came through the windows at an angle that made the dust motes visible, floating in the air above the table where a great deal had just happened. Her phone buzzed. A text from Kevin. Thomas Hale is asking if he can take his grandson to see the fish wall before they leave. She replied immediately, "Take them up yourself. Show him anything he wants to see." The next several weeks were not quiet. The story made the local news first, then the regional affiliates picked it up. Then a healthcare industry outlet ran a longer piece on construction fraud in hospital building projects, and suddenly Harlan Memorial was in more news cycles than Claire was comfortable with. The contractor issued a statement. The investor consortium issued a statement. Gerald's attorney issued 3 statements in 4 days, each one slightly less confident than the last. The stock price, Harlan was publicly traded, one of the complications of being a community hospital that had needed to grow faster than community donations could support. Dropped 11% in the first week. The board asked Claire, very carefully, whether she was certain the exposure had been necessary. She told them she was. She did not tell them that she had been less than certain at 3 a.m. On the night before the board meeting, sitting in her apartment eating cereal because there was nothing else in the apartment, staring at the documents spread across her kitchen table, asking herself whether she was about to destroy a hospital for the sake of a man she'd known for 2 hours. Then she'd gotten an email from Sandra, sent at 2:47 a.m., which read simply, "I've been trying to tell someone about the spec changes for 6 weeks. Thank you for listening." She'd finished the cereal and gone back to work. Thomas showed up at the hospital on the 3rd day after the board meeting. Not in the lobby this time. Kevin had given him a guest badge, which Dorothy had laminated with what Claire suspected was more care than strictly necessary. He found Claire in her office reviewing the independent engineering report, which had confirmed everything in his original documents and added 2 additional concerns his copies hadn't included. His grandson was not with him. A Thursday, Claire gathered. School day. He knocked on the open door. "Do you have a few minutes? Sit down." He sat. He looked at the report in her hands. "It's worse than I thought, isn't it? The 3rd floor load-bearing concern is more significant than your copies showed. The revised documentation understated the revision." Claire set the report down. "The good news is that nothing has been built yet that can't be rebuilt. The delay is going to set us back at least 5 months. Thomas nodded slowly. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said, "in the conference room when we first talked." Claire waited. "The land this hospital is on. The original donation." He paused. "I donated it in Margaret's name, my wife. She was a nurse here for 22 years. When she got her diagnosis, she told me she wasn't afraid of the dying. She was afraid the place she'd spent her whole working life would stop being the kind of place worth dying for." He looked at the window. "She made me promise I'd keep an eye on it. You've been keeping an eye on it, not closely enough. Not for a while." His voice was quieter. "I let myself step back too far. I told myself they didn't need me watching over them, that the people in charge knew what they were doing." He looked at her. "They mostly did. Until they didn't, you came back when it mattered. I almost came back 6 months ago, when I first heard about the investor group, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd been out of it too long to understand modern hospital finance." He shook his head. "I knew something was wrong. I waited because I didn't want to be the old man who couldn't let go. You weren't wrong. I was slow." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "Don't be slow, Ms. Ashworth. When something feels wrong, it's usually because it is." Claire looked at the engineering report. Then she looked at Thomas Hale, who had built a hospital in his wife's name and walked away to take care of her, and walked back when the thing she loved was being hollowed out from inside. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay, the Whitfield Wing. When it's finished, when it's actually finished correctly with the right specs and the right materials, I'd like to put Margaret's name on something in it. A room. The fish wall, if your grandson doesn't object to an upgrade." She paused. "Would that be appropriate?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "He won't object," he said finally. "He's been asking when we can visit the whale again." The reconstruction of the Whitfield Wing took 7 months, longer than anyone wanted, harder on the waiting families than anyone was comfortable with. Claire wrote personally to every family on the waiting list, not a form letter, individual letters, explaining what had happened and what was being done and what the new timeline was. She offered to speak by phone with anyone who wanted more information. 42 families called. She spoke to all 42. Sandra told her she didn't have to do it personally. Claire said she knew. The independent engineering firm that took over the project came in $300,000 under the original contract and 2 weeks ahead of the revised schedule. Claire sent them a handwritten note. The site supervisor, a woman named Gloria Reyes, who had 40 years in hospital construction and a direct manner that Claire appreciated immediately, texted back a photo of her crew on the last day of structural work with a thumbs up. Gerald Marsh was indicted on 3 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of breach of fiduciary duty 4 months after his removal from the board. His attorney issued a statement. Claire did not issue one in response, on the advice of legal counsel, and also because she didn't feel the need to say anything about it. The contractor settled with the hospital and agreed to remediate all substandard work at their own cost. The shell company was dissolved. The investor consortium, minus its fraudulent components, quietly divested and was replaced by a different group, smaller, with a longer time horizon, and with a named representative who attended every board meeting and asked questions about patient outcomes before asking about margins. The stock stabilized at 8% below its pre-scandal level and then gradually began to climb. Thomas came to the board not as a member. He said very clearly that he was not interested in being a board member, that he had a 7-year-old grandson who needed someone to take him fishing, and he was not going to sacrifice fishing season to quarterly governance meetings. But he came as an advisor occasionally when something arose that had historical bearing. He had, it turned out, an encyclopedic memory for every structural and design decision made in Harlan Memorial's first decade, which made him periodically invaluable and consistently the most interesting person in any room he was in. His grandson, whose name was Oliver, visited the fish wall every time Thomas came in. He had a particular relationship with the whale, which was turquoise with slightly asymmetrical eyes, because Oliver had been 6 when he drew it and had not yet developed significant concern for symmetry. Oliver was 7 now, and somewhat more technically exacting, but he had looked at the whale during one of their visits and informed Thomas gravely that the asymmetry was actually correct, because real whales weren't perfectly symmetrical either. Thomas had relayed this to Claire. She'd written it down, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, and kept it. The Whitfield Wing opened on a Thursday in late October. A cool day, the kind of Chicago fall that reminded you what the city was actually like underneath its warmer months. Claire stood at the entrance to the 3rd-floor pediatric oncology unit and watched the first 2 families walk through. A girl of 9 with her parents, who had been waiting 8 months, and a 4-year-old boy who was going to spend a lot of time in this place starting next week, and who was currently more interested in the fish wall than in the adults trying to explain things to him. He stopped in front of the whale. "What's that one?" he asked his mother. "I think it's a whale, baby. It's got different eyes, I see that." The boy considered this. "I like it," he said. "It looks real." Thomas was standing a few feet away, Oliver beside him, and the 2 of them were watching the boy look at the whale with expressions that were very different from each other, but came from the same place. Claire stood next to Thomas, not saying anything for a moment. "She would have liked this," Thomas said quietly. "I think so too." Claire paused. "Tell me about her, Margaret." Thomas looked at the fish wall, at the whale with the asymmetrical eyes. "She cried every time a kid was discharged," he said. "Happy crying, not sad. Every time for 22 years. She said you couldn't get used to it. That getting used to it was how you knew you were in trouble." He watched Oliver reach up and touch the edge of the whale's tail, carefully, like it might be fragile. "She would have liked you too. She used to say you could tell the good ones in the first 5 minutes if you paid attention." "What did she look for?" "She said the good ones listened more than they talked, and when something was wrong, they stayed in the room." Claire thought about the family in the waiting room on the Tuesday night in March. The daughter who hadn't understood what was happening. The hour she'd spent sitting with them while someone found a better interpreter, not because it was her job, but because it had seemed wrong to leave. "You were watching that night," she said. "My neighbor called me after." He looked at her sideways. I told you. You were deciding whether to trust me. Yes, and you did. Thomas looked back at the whale. I did. Oliver turned around from the wall with the particular energy of a 7-year-old who has been patient for long enough. Pop, can we get lunch? You said. I said if you were patient. I was patient for a long time. You were patient for approximately 8 minutes. That's long for me. Thomas looked at Claire. We're going to go get lunch. Join us? Claire had 3 meetings this afternoon. A budget review and 2 calls and a follow-up with the new contractor about the Phase 2 expansion. She had not taken a lunch outside the building in. She thought about it, longer than she could remember. Where? She said. There's a diner 2 blocks over. Oliver likes the grilled cheese. It has the crusts cut off, Oliver said seriously. That's important. Claire took off her badge and set it on the nurse's station counter. Let's go. They walked out through the lobby, Thomas and Oliver and Claire, past Dorothy's desk, where Dorothy looked up and watched them go with an expression that was the particular expression of someone who has seen a great deal and understood, in this moment, that something had landed the way it was supposed to. Outside, the fall air was sharp, and the trees along the street had gone orange, and the city was doing what it always did, which was to move in every direction at once without apparent concern for what was happening in any particular building on any particular block. Oliver reached up and took his grandfather's hand. Then after a moment took Claire's. Come on, he said. The diner closes early on Thursdays. It didn't, as it turned out, close early on Thursdays. But they went anyway, and the grilled cheese was, as advertised, served without crusts. And Thomas told a story about the week they poured the foundation of Harlan Memorial in 2003 in the middle of a February that nobody involved would ever forget, and Oliver fell asleep in the booth between courses, his head on Thomas's arm, and outside the window the city went on being itself, indifferent and continuous, and inside the diner the 3 of them sat for a long time, without anyone needing to be anywhere else. Sometimes that was how it happened. Not in a boardroom, not in a headline, not in the resolution of some legal process that gave everything a proper name and an ending. Sometimes it happened in a diner booth on a Thursday in October, with a grilled cheese and a sleeping child, and the understanding that the right thing had been done, and the right people had done it, and that was enough. That had always been enough.